Hello, if you're just joining us, this is the BSME in conversation with none other than Terri White. And we're just going to give it a couple of minutes while we let everyone arrive. So we'll have a little pause while people roll in and we let the room fill up. And thank you very much for giving your lunch time to come and join us. We hope the next hour will be really useful. We'll make some small talk while we're waiting. I don't
really do small talk.
No, but we're here in this rather swanky Soho restaurant, which is Bob Ricard. Well, nice, isn't it? It's a shame we're not eating our lunch here today, but they've very kindly let us use it as they have for previous BSME events to have our conversation today. They're not actually open, so hopefully it's not too loud and we don't get noisy customers in. We shall see. We shall see. Where have you come from today, Terri? Have you come from home?
I have come from home, the Saddleworth Moors. I now live in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah.
So this is really exciting. There's a bar, there's alcohol, there's human beings, there's no sheep. I mean,
it's IRL for us. And, I normally am the one, because I live in the Midlands. I work at Bauer Media's Peterborough office. So I'm normally the one who can sort of say, oh, I've come a long way. It's cost me £100 on the train, all that. But I've been beaten by Terri up in Manchester in the northwest.
Yeah, outside of Manchester.
Outside of Manchester.
Not even Manchester anymore. I'm now a countryside dweller.
Okay. So we'll just keep an eye on the numbers. David, are we nearly good to go? Another minute. Let's give it one more minute. We'll get going at 3 minutes past. And we'll just let people roll in. There are still people joining the room. So bear with us for one more minute and we will get formally underway.
I am disappointed that we haven't pressed the champagne button yet. Isn't that the entire point of coming to Bob Ricard?
Maybe I have been.
I thought you were looking a little bit. Think the wheels may come off.
We shall see. We shall see. Right. Okay. Well, listen, it's 3 minutes past. I think we're good to go. So let's formally start. If you've just joined us, welcome. I'm Tim Pollard. I'm the Group Digital Editorial Director, bit of a mouthful, at Bauer Media. And I'm the chair, the 2022 chair of the BSME, the British Society of Magazine Editors. So thank you for joining us today. But the biggest thanks really go to Terri White, our special guest today. Now, each year, the BSME awards the Mark Boxer Award, and it's our Lifetime Achievement Award. I'm delighted to remind everyone that the 2021 winner was Terri for all the work she did in magazines over 2 decades. And we're meeting today to discuss her experiences, what you've learned along the way. It's a bit of a retrospective, but I want to get inside the mind of someone who's worked and edited, some of the biggest titles in the UK and also in the US, and try and learn some nuggets of intel. Our audience today, we've got a lot of journalists, a lot of editors, a lot of people who are deputy editors, creatives, some of the art people. So there's a real mix out there that I want to try and impart, just tease out from Terri what she's learned along the way. And I suppose there's no better place to start, maybe, than sort of asking Terri, why journalism? Why did you get into it in the first place?
Do you know what? It wasn't journalism, it was magazines specifically. So I was obsessed with magazines right from being a little girl. I used to save my babysitting money and then my Saturday job money and my newspaper round money, and I would use them to buy Just 17 mainly, but then also a bit of Sugar, a bit of Bliss. I could at this point pretend that I was really cool and read The Enemy at like 13 years old, but I didn't. But I loved it. It was, for me, I grew up in a little village. Anybody who knows me knows I didn't have the most picture perfect childhood, and what magazines presented for me were both an escape into another world that I couldn't even imagine at that point, but also a brilliant gang. So it's like being welcomed into a world full of people just like you, really, who had a lot of the same desires and worries and concerns, and I found real solidarity and weirdly companionship in the pages of these magazines, and I was obsessed ever since then. And then I just decided that I wanted to be a magazine editor.
I'm quite intrigued to drill in, Terri, a little bit more. So you started at the bottom, you're an editor's PA, you kind of got your sort of first writing jobs. Now I've done a little bit of research and spoken to a few people who've worked with you over the years, but no, one of the things they describe is somebody is an editor when you were lastly an editor who was all over the brief, who actually understood the minutiae almost across the board, you know, from digital things to subscription plans to new product development. How important do you think that is? And it is moving around between the different roles. Do you think you did that? Does it happen by accident or?
No, no, I am a bit of a control freak. If Chris Lupton's watching this right now, he'll be like nodding his head violently. I am a bit of a control freak. A lot of editors are. But I think it's really important to have a brilliant team around you who do their jobs better than you ever could. But I did feel it was important, especially as the magazine industry became more challenged, was to have a full understanding of the bigger picture. So to understand marketing, to understand subscriptions, to understand every single department so that I understood exactly the experience our readers were getting. And also could understand how to get the most out of the brand. You know, a brand like Empire can't just live and die by the stuff you put in the magazine, to put it crudely. How do we get to new audiences? How do we make sure the existing audience is brilliantly satisfied and challenged? How do we build out amazing partnerships that really benefit the brand and benefit the brand we're working with? Like, all of that is really important in this day and age. And I think all editors should have an understanding, while also never forgetting that your job is to be an editor. So I would read every page of the magazine, mark up every single proof, and you know, that was one of the biggest joys of my job at the end. I loved working on pages. It's the thing I miss more than anything, and it's trying to find that balance between the core responsibilities of your job as an editor, but also understanding the wider business. And especially if you're having shared resources, if you're sharing the marketing team with 2 other magazines, how do you work with them to get exactly what you need for your title? I'm also quite competitive, which helps. So, you know, I was always fighting Empire's corner, and I think that's crucial.
Which, you know, what you're describing, hubbing, shared backroom facilities, you know, we're all familiar with that now, aren't we? I think all publishers. So you started obviously in sort of Later and Woman and Home. Now, interestingly, your next move was onto, I think you were on the launch team for Nuts, and you ended up in Maxon. So you kind of already, and one of the things I find fascinating about you know, I've worked in the cloistered world of automotive for the whole career. I'm a motoring journalist by trade, whereas you've hopped around between genres. How did you find that? And what are your sort of reflections now on the whole, I suppose, let's call it the Lads Mag scene? What are your reflections?
Well, I'll split that question, if I can, into 2 parts. So in terms of working in multiple markets, I thought it was really important, because I think there can be a tendency for editors to think that they are automatically the reader. So if I'm a bloke working on a men's mag, I am the reader, therefore, you know, my decision making is just based on my personal preferences. I always believed that a good editor knows the market, knows the landscape, and knows the reader inside out, knows exactly what they want. And so I always saw it as my job just to make sure that I was an expert in everything, and to never fall back on, I think, lazy assumptions about, well, if I like it, then the readers will. And that discipline comes with working for magazines that are far away from who you are personally. So my second job was Woman and Home. I was 22, 23, writing for women in their 50s, 60s and up. Then I went to Now magazine and did True Life, and then I went to Nuts. And actually what it does is it helps you master the toolkit of editing. When it comes to men's mags, which is the other part of your question. So when I joined Nuts, I mean, this is how mad it used to be when there were launches in the noughties, early noughties, every few months, like millions of pounds being spent by the big publishers. And I was working on Now magazine, and Phil Hilton got in touch to say he was working on a new magazine launch, couldn't tell me what it was, couldn't tell me the market, couldn't tell me anything about it, but offered me a job as deputy news editor on this new magazine. And I was young and just thought, fuck it. Excuse me, I know it's early in the day, but just thought, fuck it, you know, I can get experience. It's a big step up. I was really excited about, I thought, working on a new launch, which became something I became quite addicted to, I have to say. Such a ride. And when I turned up on the first day, they said, oh, it's called Nuts and it's a weekly men's magazine. I remember thinking, I have to answer the phone and say, hello, Nuts, for like the rest of however long I work here for. When it started, it had a line which was the magazine fathers and sons can enjoy together, which I'm sure is probably raising a few eyebrows out there right now.
Not in my household.
But yeah, probably in mine. But what it was meant to be kind of a weekly loaded, but there weren't any naked women in it at that point. The first issue had Nell McAndrew in some leggings and a crop top, like a fitness outfit. We had Beyonce in a rah-rah skirt and a top. Like, nudity wasn't on the agenda at first. And I did news. So, you know, I do things like, if an SAS hero did something notable in the news, I'd find the SAS hero and try and get him to be interviewed. I interviewed, you know, people who'd been in the mafia, for example. I mean, true crime was a big part of it. And then what happened was the market evolved very quickly. The readers were saying they wanted more female nudity in the magazine, and that's the kind of direction of travel it went in. You know, I wrote about this afterwards for The Observer, which is, I had some real challenges and struggles with a lot of the content as it evolved, as I think a lot of people did who worked on those magazines, especially what we call the real girl phase, which is when girls who weren't professional models would appear in a magazine. I really felt, you know, as a working class woman, my career, by the way, was going from strength to strength. I got promoted to be features editor and then associate editor, and I was still only 25 to 26. But I really felt that as a working class woman, was I exploiting other working class women to kind of make my own career better? And I really struggled with a lot of it, and eventually I did leave. But that's not to say, you know, I didn't work on some stuff that was pretty out there and pretty hard to stomach. And I'm kind of really open about that. But what I would say is, it was a room full of incredible journalists and magazine people, the best designers, the best picture people, the best subs. I mean, just incredible journalists who were really good at their job. And I think that market kind of imploded in the end, and that was a natural consequence of lots of cultural issues, you know, the rise of the internet, a kind of a pushback against that masculinity, which was seen as quite toxic. And, you know, I think if you think about how much our attitudes towards that kind of media has changed in the last 20 years, it's kind of extraordinary.
And magazine brands do reflect the time and the culture they exist in, don't they?
Yes.
I think, you know, we at About, or EMAP as it was, you know, had Max Power in the car one. That was a huge, you know, followed a very similar trajectory. But you ended up from nuts. Let's talk about the next stage of your career. I think Maxim and Shortlist. Well, tell us a little bit about what happened there and why you were tempted away. So did you actually leave Nuts really because you were feeling you were distancing from the content and you were big having to produce?
Yeah, so, and well, I was kind of seconded on a few launches while I was at Nuts. So Mike Sutar had kind of pulled me off onto certain projects. So I worked on the launch of Pick Me Up, and then I worked on the development of a magazine that ended up being Look magazine, the weekly high street fashion magazine. Worked on that on and off for about a year, 18 months, and I was offered the job of deputy editor for Launch. And then at the same time, Derek Harbinson, who'd been the deputy editor of Nuts, left to be editor of Maxim, and he offered me a job as his deputy, and I took the Maxim job. And, you know, that was going through an incredibly challenging period, as men's media kind of did at that point. And I could see the writing on the wall quite quickly with Maxim, and I just resigned. And thankfully, as you know, there's quite a lot of luck involved in a lot of this. I got a call again from Phil Hilton saying, I'm working on another launch. Do you want to come and join? And I joined Shortlist as digital editor initially, and eventually becoming deputy editor and then editor. And that was my first editorship at 29.
That was a significant title, wasn't it, Shorts? I think you won a BSME for your work there, is that right?
Yeah.
And on which note, I would just like to say as a quick sort of plug, don't forget that the BSME Awards deadline is actually 6 p.m. today. I hope that any of you who are in working for titles are sort of aware of that. And if you need any help, do contact David. It's worth David or Juliet for BSME administrators. So I'm just having a note put up here. Yes, if anyone's struggling, then do get in touch with David or Juliet. But 6 p.m. today is the deadline. Also, if anyone's just joined now, so if you're wondering who I am, I'm Tim Pollard. I am the 2022 chair of the BSME. We're in conversation with Terri White. We're in the wonderful surroundings of Bob Rickard in Soho, the home of the Press for Champagne button, which we haven't used yet. But we're here talking about Terri's career. It's fantastic to sort of hear some of this, some of the stories behind your career so far. And I suppose I'm hearing someone who's really, it's fantastic, a number of different genres and segments you've moved through. So can I just sort of drill into a bit more, but you're firmly of the belief that it's a very transferable skill. A good editor should be able to absolutely take on any brief, so long as you're surrounded by the right people. Or...
Well, as long as you do your job as the editor. Your job as the editor is not to be the reader. That is and that's one of the biggest misunderstandings. I think sometimes people come into magazines thinking their job is to be the reader, make decisions based on that. That absolutely isn't the job of a magazine editor. Job of a magazine editor is to know your reader better than anybody else knows them, certainly better than any of your competitor knows them, knows what their worries are, what their concerns are, what their needs are, what their desires are, know what they're going to be worried about in 2 years' time, know what they're going to want to know in 2 years' time. And it's absolutely transferable. I should be able to turn up in your building tomorrow and edit one of your car magazines as somebody who can't even fucking drive. That should be what an editor does. And I think one of the biggest misunderstandings is you go and work on one title that you're the reader of and you stay there forever. I don't think, I think you can still do a good job even if you do have massive similarities to the reader, obviously. But I think it's just important to have real discipline around how you edit that magazine or website or whatever it is, and make sure your understanding of the reader has real depth and integrity.
How did you do that? Would it be, is it research departments looking at data, going and just meeting all readers? What's the secret? How do you do that?
All of that. I think one of the biggest losses is that focus groups have kind of fallen a little bit out of fashion in recent times. Partly, I think, because of the cost, because a really good research department or, agency that does qual and quant research is actually quite expensive because it's a massive skill. But there is nothing like sitting in a room, or usually the other side of a two-way mirror, watching your reader, because those are the people you will have in your head the next time you're trying to make a decision. And hearing them speak, hearing about their lives, hearing what they love, what they don't like, nothing kind of compares to that. But that absolutely then has to be coupled with data. It has to be coupled with the very best research about, we used to draw pen portraits of the reader. We would give them a name, an age, a location, what shower gel do they use in the shower, what transport do they use to get to work, do they have a girlfriend or a boyfriend, do they have kids, like what do they do in their spare time, like literally plan their day minute by minute so that you understand exactly what they're doing, but also where the opportunities are to intersect with them. So what are they doing with their lunch hour? Can you in some way reach them then? When are they reading the magazine? When are they reading the website? When are they spending money? Can you get them to spend that money with your brand? It's kind of all in the detail, really. And it's a mixture of all of those things. And then also instinct. I think a good editor really kind of goes with their gut as well.
I think, what you're describing there, the amount of data we have today, I work in a digital environment. Goodness, the analytics for data is enormous. And yet there's that sweet spot, isn't there? I always think there's a sweet spot where human expertise and insight fuses with data.
Yeah.
You just follow pure data without any human insight or editorial, what the editorial expertise can do, that can work. They might be a bit soulless or take you in strange directions. The magic happens when you do both.
Yeah, but and we see it, right? You see awful, and when I say awful, I don't mean this about all SEO, but you see content which is entirely driven by SEO without any human filter over the top. And that misses the kind of real magic in how you build a connection with your audience. And, you know, any good digital product, you will know more than anybody, is a mix of SEO and what do we know about what they're doing on social, and what do we know about what they're doing on other platforms? Where are they coming from? Where are they going afterwards? And then what are they doing when they're not online? And so I think it has to be a mix of those things, but it also, you have a human instinct as a human being, and if you've spent time getting to know them as fully rounded human beings, not just somebody on a computer, and you will have a instinct in your belly when it comes to what do they want and how do we deliver that for them.
Yeah, I totally agree. Now, it is worth pointing out, we will be, we're planning to talk for probably a good sort of 40-45 minutes. We're aiming to leave a bit of time at the end for asking any questions. So do feel free to pop some questions in the chat. We have got a screen here. If you see me peering, it's because I'm trying to see if any questions are popping up. So we'll either answer them as we go along, or maybe leave a bit of time at the end to come back and do some Q&A. So do get busy with that. Let's talk, Terri, about your switch to the US. Not many journalists end up making the journey over, but in fact, there are a few very well-known Brits, aren't there? You know, I'm thinking Anna Wintour, Tina Brown, one Terri White, who have ended up over there. What drove that? How did the opportunity arise? And tell me about how you found it.
I mean, I think most magazine journalists kind of have a little core of their heart and soul where they imagine their career in New York. And that's a mixture of what we see in films and TV, and, you know, the kind of narrative around New York as the ultimate city for publishing is quite strong, I think. And so I'd kind of always had this fantasy in my head about editing a magazine there. That felt to me like the kind of ultimate aim. And what happened was, I worked initially for Bauer US. They were looking for some recommendations for senior editorial staff. Somebody put my name forward. I had interviews here, interviews in the States, and that first job was as executive editor on Life and Style in New York. And so it was a bit of a whirlwind, actually. I was freelance at the time. I'd been working for the Sun's TV magazine just before that. And from kind of initial conversation to moving out there was only a couple of months.
And as an outsider, I use that in the sense of, I suppose, sort of an overseas person, really, but arriving there, how was it? And I suppose I'm quite intrigued to know if actually distance can almost help sometimes, you know, that sort of completely fresh and see completely unknown. Did that help, or was that tough?
It is tough because you have to get to know an entire new, not just an entire new market, which is what happens when you shift between markets, but an entire new country and an entirely different mindset. So American media can be really quite conservative, which you don't really think of, because I think we think of the US as New York and LA, which are very liberal, which are really kind of creative, but there's a massive bit, everyone calls it middle America, but it's pretty much all of America. And so it was a real learning curve for me, understanding the difference between the UK and the US. I have to say, in my experience, the UK industry is way more nimble, is way more able to innovate and to do it very quickly. We're very agile, I think, and always have been. And we're also, you know, not averse to completely batshit ideas. So I've been in development processes for launches, and people have come up with the most insane ideas. I remember while working on the development of Look, presenting a idea to Mike Sutar, I think it was Sylvia, or she was the CEO of IPC at the time. And I presented this idea for a feature called Bring Back Fingering, which was, yes, you heard me, which was this sex feature that I was pitching. I'm stood in front of these management people talking about why we should have this sealed sex section, which included conversations like fingering. And I could never have stood in a New York boardroom and said that, because I would have probably been shipped straight back home. So I think there's a verve and a spirit to British magazine publishing that I really love, and an innovation and creativity that often isn't recognised, and it's something I only really, I think, truly appreciated when I moved away.
And is that why some of the, I mentioned a few there, but there is a sort of a history, isn't there, of Brits going over and editing some of the big titles there? Do you think that's what drives it? Is that what appeals?
Well, I think it is partly the glamour and the idea of it. and some people take to it much better than others. You know, Dan Wakeford is a friend of mine who was most recently editor-in-chief of People magazine. He's had an amazing career in the US and loves it out there. Lots of British people have made the transition really, really successfully. And I think it will always be part of a magazine journalist stream. The number of people when I lived in New York who would be like, can you tell me how I can get a job in American magazines? I think it's sometimes just trying to stack up the reality of it against the fantasy.
And I suppose, those who've worked abroad and started a new career in a different country, I mean, sometimes I think the job of being an editor can be quite lonely anyway. But, if you're sort of 2,000-3,000 miles away, maybe that's manifold. But do you think that? Do you think as you've edited different titles, can it be quite lonely?
Oh, massively, because you have brilliant senior team. You usually have a deputy, a creative director, people you are really close to professionally. But there are certain things that you can't talk to anyone about. So you'll know this. There are certain conversations you will have with management, for example, that are absolutely not permitted to be shared with anyone else. There'll be certain decisions you have to make, which are incredibly difficult, which can be about people's jobs, about people's pay. And really, that's a big responsibility, and it can make it quite lonely, because when you're kind of a section editor, you have people on your level who you can go down the pub and be like, oh God, such and such was such a dick today. Like, and there's a camaraderie in that. As an editor, not so much. And so I think it is really difficult. And it probably was exacerbated in another country, because you kind of got that loneliness around the responsibilities that come with the job, but also you're 3,000 miles away from home. Everybody's going, who's the weird British person over there? So it adds, I think, an extra layer to it.
It's worth saying at that point, a little unintended, but a plug for the BSME, the British Society of Magazine Editors. This organisation, we're here to help support editors, and I think that's the reason I got involved. It's run by editors for editors, and I think for me that's really powerful, because it can be, you're the top person, you carry the can. Amazing power, amazing opportunity, and career to follow. But that's what the BSM, one of the things we're here for, to provide a sense of community and support. It's fascinating to hear about this. Now, you have moved, between, you've had more jobs and more titles than I have in my career, and I've moved a fair bit. Is there an optimum time to stay on a brand as an editor? You come in.
Yes.
Is there an optimum time frame? You go, what? There's a BBE, there's a best before end date, and I need to.
There is. I think you shouldn't stay anywhere unless something goes wrong. You shouldn't stay anywhere for too little time, because all anybody thinks is what really happened there. Especially if you leave by mutual consent, which, by the way, if you ever see a statement saying mutual consent, it does not mean it was mutual consent. It means they were fired. But also, I think it's really important to have a fresh editor's eye on a brand, especially long-standing brands. So I think probably with Empire, for example, if I hadn't have left when I did, I think I'd probably have had another year and a half. So I left at 6 years. So I think probably 8 is the maximum. I think it's really important for there to be an evolving perspective, and obviously that can come from the team, and any great editor kind of anticipates cultural shifts, moves with them. But I think there is a window where you probably can do all you personally do brand. You can shift it to a certain level, and then I think it has to move to somebody else for it to feel current and invigorated and fresh. And I think there are examples of brands where editors have stayed too long and it's become one note and it's stayed the same product. And I think that's incredibly dangerous.
When you talk about agility and innovation and fresh ideas, I suppose that's easier if you do, isn't it? Now, I'm going to do some questions as we go along. So there's a few that feel like they fit quite nicely here. There's one comment from Chris Lupton, your former art director, who says, please don't touch my screen again, Terry. So thanks, Chris.
You love it, Chris Lupton.
And Chris has, I'm pleased to say, actually joined the BSME committee. He's on the committee with us at the moment. It means we're represented now by a very senior, very experienced art director. So thank you for that, Chris. Now, we've got a couple of people who've actually asked, if Terry could edit a magazine on any subject, what would it be? any subjects, not which title, are there any subjects that you would actually really like to have worked with?
Do you know what, like Empire and film was always kind of the dream, but I always had this fantasy of editing what I'd call a proper entertainment magazine. So by that I mean like an entertainment weekly. That's not weekly, it's monthly now, but it's, you know, film and TV and music, and something that is representative of a wider culture than just one specialist niche. I don't think that's ever going to happen, so it's kind of a moot point, but that was always a fantasy of mine.
I loved Word magazine.
Oh yeah.
I don't subscribe to many magazines. Word, you know, created by some, it was a proper independent magazine. It's fabulous. I was so sad when that shut.
I know, but here we are, right? So this is the problem, right? So Hot Dog, film magazine that everybody raved about, Jack, a men's magazine that everyone raved about, and not enough people buy them. And then people like you and I sit here and have a conversation saying, wasn't that brilliant? And what I always try and say to people is, if you genuinely love a magazine and you can afford it, obviously, please buy it or subscribe, because the outpouring of love when these magazines closed, look at Q, the outpouring of love was ridiculous. But if everybody who said how much they loved it had engaged with it or bought it at some point in the 2 years before it closed, then we wouldn't have been having that conversation. I know this isn't what you asked, but I just have to get that off my chest.
Couldn't agree more.
Because those we only survive if people pay for the product in some way, shape or form.
And magazine subscriptions do make a wonderful gift as well, actually. You know, great and very easy present to give.
You could be on QVC. This is amazing.
QVC is based in Peterborough as well, where I work. I totally agree with that. And I think, and actually, if you're a BSME member, I'm just plugging BSME membership, we actually give a range of subsidized, quite heavily subsidized magazine subscriptions. Another reason to become a member, guys. Okay, we're in New York, and you know, fascinating time over there. And I know actually quite a tough time. I have read your book. You've not asked us to plug this, but I've actually, as part of my research, read Terry's book.
Oh God.
Coming Undone. I don't, you know, there's actually really, this is about you and your personal life, probably more so, not much of the professional, little snippets. And I think actually some of the loneliness of editing, I kind of took away from there. But I suppose it ends with you coming back to the UK. Let's talk about this, about what lures you back to Empire. But I think the next role was it specifically for that role?
Yes. So I went to edit Time Out New York, which was an incredible gig, like one of those kind of pinch me moments, because I love Time Out as a brand. Time Out New York had real kind of, well, it had at one point a real status as an iconic title in New York, but I felt it had kind of become quite rote, had become quite predictable, had really lost its connection with the city. So when I got approached for editing that just seemed like the most exciting gig ever. And I did that for 18 months, and then I got the call about Empire. And I suppose it was twofold, one of which is I'd had a very difficult time with my mental health during my time in New York. Something about the kind of toxicity of New York coupled with my mental state really didn't go well together. I spent time in a psychiatric ward, and I think I realised that I was probably going to have to come home. And Empire had kind of always been the dream. And so when I got the call, it felt like somebody was intervening and saying, look, let's take you out of this situation, get you home. And I came back for Empire, and it's probably the only magazine I would have come back for, because again, I felt like we made massive changes at Time Out New York. We took it free. I completely kind of restructured the team. We did a magazine redesign. We relaunched the website.
Using some of your shortlist kind of experiences.
Yes. So
very similar kind of.
Yeah, so that really helped. But also having launched or worked on launch teams of so many titles, I really understood how you kind of either launched or relaunched products. So we relaunched the Time Out magazine in Chicago, which I was also editing by the end. So it was an incredible experience, but I thought I'd probably got another couple of years in me if I didn't die, at some point. And so, but the Empire, it was just too good to turn down, because I knew Mark Dinning had been there for a decade or whatever. And so I just thought, if I don't take this now, somebody else is going to get this job and it's not going to come up for another decade. So again, another whirlwind, really. I think I gave 2 weeks notice, which is standard in New York, and was back home the week after that.
Wow. And I guess for more, it's not your first time editing. You probably didn't know at the time it was going to be in the current phase, your last gig at editing, but with that experience gained, did you just hit the ground? Did you have a really clear idea of what you wanted that to be?
I did, and do you know what? It's been weird watching it's been weird watching politics over the last few weeks, right? Because I knew that when I took over Empire, it was going to go one of two ways. It was going to go brilliantly, or I was going to lose trust it, right? And thankfully,
new verb.
I didn't lose trust it, because it could have gone spectacularly wrong. I had a very firm idea of what I thought Empire should be, and I thought it was. I thought it should always be niche, because film is niche and not niche at the same time, but I felt that the print product should be niche, but I felt like the wider brand should be a church for everybody and anybody who loved film, but also TV.
But at the heart of it, the magazine, the sort of almost film nerdy, people
Yes.
who really love film, and then, because that's fascinating. I have a view, and I'd be interested to see what your thoughts are about how malleable brands are. So at the core, it's like the core essence here, but some of the website let's talk about it. Now I don't think you launched a podcast, but you turned Empire into a very multi-platform.
Yeah,
brand.
I mean, it was all kind of there. That's the thing. Chris Hewitt launched the Empire podcast kind of on his own. Nobody in the business really knew he was doing it. They just did it. And all of the stuff was there, but they were operating in silo. So often people didn't know what other sections were doing. So, for example, apparently there was a time before I joined where section editors didn't communicate about what they were covering in their section. So sometimes somebody would only realise when the magazine came out that the same person had been interviewed in two separate sections of the magazine for two different projects. So I was all about bringing everybody together. There is so much talent on Empire. It's easily the most talented team I've ever worked with. And I just felt like they needed leadership, and it needed a proper cohesive vision, because the reality is that the audience in print is going to be a core kind of heartbeat of Empire. But the digital channels, the website, social, the podcast, events, all of that should be an open door to anyone who loves film and TV. So if I'm really excited about Andor, I should be able to go and tweet Empire or read something on the website. I shouldn't have to go and spend £5 on a magazine if actually I've got kind of one interest that magazine can serve me for. I really felt like we needed to look at it as a bigger brand. How do we bring people into the brand, and then how do we move them around the brand? So people who've signed up for the podcast were really committed. How can we transfer them to be magazine subscribers? People who came to our social channels, how do we get them to actually go to the website more regularly? And moving people around and finding opportunities to engage with them. Because, the reality is that when I took over, it was very heavily male, and 51% of cinema going audiences are women. The people who mainly buy the tickets for the pictures are women. And this kind of misnomer that men own film culture really fucking got my goat, to be honest. And I felt like Empire could be a home for women, and not just in the readership, but in the pages of the magazine. Why weren't we doing young female directors? Why weren't we looking at people outside, I suppose, of the legends of film? So for me, it was all about where do we get to play in the wider brand to bring in the biggest audience possible, because the thought that film and TV was completely exclusive was madness to me when it's one of the biggest mediums in culture, especially right now.
And there, in a nutshell, you have several things. You have zeal. You're passionate about this, aren't you?
Yeah.
It's amazing the power that editors have. So passion and zeal and a purpose, real purpose, and also fused with a bit of research. You dropping a little nugget there, but actually most tickets are bought by women. Fascinating. One of the things which we've been asked about is the covers, the role of a cover on a magazine, and that's obviously changing. And in fact, we've maybe talked about that briefly, but what did you try and do with your team? And it was a whole team effort, and particularly Chris, who's probably on the call. What was your goal? What were you trying to do with the colours, and how important were they to your strategy of stretching the brand?
The covers were everything, and it's a real challenge when you're a newsstand magazine. So let me tell you, having edited 2 free magazines, it's amazing. You create poster-like artwork, like it's the biggest indulgence and the biggest kind of creative freedom you will ever have. I often think newsstand magazines don't get enough respect for what they do. For example, the TV listings magazines, the way they pack those covers with cells and make them bang on for their audience and never win any awards, maybe apart from a BSME, or get the plaudits because they don't look beautiful and they don't have 0 cover lines. I think there needs to be a better understanding of the commercial pressures that newsstand magazines are operating under when they build their covers. Chris and I worked like dogs on our covers, and there were many things that were important. Exclusivity, right? If I'm expecting somebody to pay £4.99 for this magazine, they have to get something that they cannot get anywhere else, not on social media, not on the internet. So we were really strict about that image being a world exclusive to Empire. You couldn't see it or get it anywhere else. It would often be a first look. It would often be something they'd not seen from that film or from that character. And it had to be dynamic, it had to be exciting. But it was, it was a struggle because we were working with the biggest film studios in the world. We were often fighting with EW. But where we kind of started to do some really interesting stuff, really driven by Chris, I have to say, was on the subscriber covers. So the subscriber covers were often illustrated, they were really conceptual, they were really kind of brilliant in their granular detail. There would often be little clues in there and hidden Easter eggs, and you would have to be kind of a hardcore fan to understand what was going on that cover. So it was flattering to a subscriber, but we delivered on our promise for it to be collectible, for us to give them something every month that they could keep and treasure. And not only was it flattering to them, but it was something they wanted to keep. It was something we thought was beautiful. We got so much reaction to our subscriber covers every single month, and the challenge really was, how do we kind of pair them with the newsstand covers for it to be cohesive when one's super commercial and one's the opposite. And I think where we got to, especially during lockdown, when we had no film art and there was no films coming out, is what can Empire create? Empire has the world's best access to the biggest actors and filmmakers on the planet. What can we do? So we shot Tom Hiddleston as Tom Hiddleston, not as Loki, and that flew off the shelf. We had to reprint that issue. We did Edgar Wright's cinema issue, Greatest Cinema Moments. That was an fully illustrated newsstand cover, and that did amazingly. We actually had to reprint that one. We did the Best of British issue where we shot, well, we had 5 covers, but I think we shot 20 people in the end, and creating our own covers, and therefore owning that content and really delivering on that connection with the audience became, I think, in the last year of my editorship, I was really excited by that. Chris was really excited.
And who would have thought, the pandemic has been a bit of a shit show, hasn't it? And yet it's driven creativity and innovation. We've had to do it.
Yeah.
And there'll be some really lasting benefits, won't there?
Well, we tore up our cover strategy. So I would have calls with studios where I'd say there has to be, everything has to be in character. We can't do actor covers as themselves because they bomb, because historically they bombed. And then when you're in the position of having to do it, and it's somebody like Tom Hiddleston, of course that's not going to bomb. It's Tom Hiddleston. Yeah. And Chris threw in a genius Loki, like a shadow reference to Loki, so it became really collectible for the fans of that franchise. So it drove creativity and also made us challenge some of our preconceptions. So things that I'd automatically shut down, like the thought of a fully illustrated cover, I'd be like, don't be fucking stupid. We've got to sell it like in a supermarket. Who's going to understand what's going on? And we challenged every single rule we were operating under and set fire to most of them. And I think we ended up with a better magazine for it.
Now, I'm aware we've got 10 minutes left, so I'm going to ask one sort of final-ish question, and then let's make sure we leave some time, because there are quite a few questions in the queue, so we will come to those. So what made you take the switch? Now, I mentioned your book coming undone. You've written the book. and I understand, you know, you obviously left Empire, and you're writing a script for this. It's going to be a TV adaptation. Tell us a little bit about, I suppose, what you know, how your life as a journalist and editor has prepared you for what comes next, and how are you finding it?
Oh, do you know what? It's weird. It's just been a year. And I think I found it more difficult than I thought I would, to be honest. I mean, I made the decision quite quickly, and I've been very open about why I made that decision. I had a son, and I didn't feel the working hours and the demands of the job were compatible anymore with me being a parent. And, you know, I knew it was a hard decision when I was making it. I felt pretty devastated. Immediately after I left, I was like, great, fresh start. Let's, you know, I've got the script was coming down the line, and I had some other projects. But I miss being in a gang of people who are all united around a common purpose and a common goal, which is building, you know, it was building the most brilliant film and TV brand in the world, and we were all united in that, and that brings a certain energy to your life and to your working days. I've never not worked in an office. I've never not worked with other people. I now work alone mainly, and it is challenging, and I've had to kind of get used to the shift gradually, and I don't regret it, because I made the right decision for myself and for my family. And also, you know, 21 years is a pretty good innings, and I thought it was time for a new start. And I'm not sure it prepares you really, because it's such a unique thing you do when you edit a magazine. I don't know if there's anything like it. The way your days are, the things you do together, like, it's just such a unique experience. And I think in some respects I had to draw a line under it and make a fresh start, and not see it as a continuation of that. And, you know, I won't go back on stuff at a magazine. That's kind of me done now.
We'll not see a Terri White version,
No.
well, not version 2, version sort of 8 or 9, I think. But
No more magazines.
Okay, well, listen, I have got more questions, but I'm going to dive in. I don't want to miss out on some of the brilliant questions coming in. So there's one from viewer Anna Louise Dearden. Sorry if I'm peering, we'll see my ugly mug getting closer. The type is quite small. Hi Terri, I'm Lou, a fellow working class Northerner and journalist. You've just answered my question about your main driver for leaving Empire and gainful employment to go freelance, but can you recommend a group or network of people who meet up every now and then in London town? I miss my magazine teams. I was kind of stepping on to about loneliness, or like, particularly became freelance. What's your advice?
Oh God, and I don't know any groups. I'm so sorry, because I don't live in London anymore, and also I'm a terrible group joiner person. So I got kicked out of my NCTJ WhatsApp group for never answering any of the WhatsApp messages. I've never been much of a joiner, even though I love working in teams. I suppose my advice is to try and punctuate your days at home, working at home, with days when you're out. So for example, you know, I've been at home the last couple of days, and I'd put today in, I've got another thing after this, I'm down for 2 days next week. So I think it's really important to physically leave your house, I have to say, is it can get a little bit. I've been writing the script all summer, I've been working on a radio documentary that's going to be out in a couple of months, and those things which involve leaving the house, meeting with other people, those projects are really important to me, along with the writing that I do kind of alone at home. So if you can mix it up and go out, but maybe if anybody does know of any brilliant freelance groups in London, if you give me a shout, I can tweet it later. I do know that Sean Meades Williams, I think there is a freelance journalist group. I'll find out and I'll tweet it.
Brilliant. And that's for BSME as well. Obviously, Anna Louise, I'm biased, but you know, the BSME hopes to sort of connect people as well. Here's one from Becky Wells, who actually is an automotive journalism, so I do know Becky. Hi, Becky. But she asks about, she's basically worked her whole career in automotive, and she's intrigued by this notion that actually it's perfectly possible to move around and hop. And she's basically asking for any advice. You know, how can I highlight other skills, and what is best to talk about to help move into, you know, working as a section editor, maybe in a different sector? What advice would you give to someone who's worked in one sector and they want to make that leap as you did?
It's all about your toolkit of skills as opposed to the content, if you know what I mean. So if you've got an interview somewhere, don't talk necessarily about a specific type of content you did, talk about the skill that you used. So if it's, you know, you're a brilliant copy editor, you're a brilliant commissioner, you have incredible contacts, like these are the things to really highlight, because I think people forget that it's the skills that really matter. I've hired people millions of times who have no experience in the market that I'm working in, but they've shown brilliant journalism skills at another title, and those are the things that are really important, and that's what you will end up being hired on. So try and focus as much as possible on what you're actually doing, as opposed to the nature of the content itself.
Brilliant. And it's interesting, there's quite a few questions on this topic. So Jamie Kafash, who I believe is editor of Pulse, he asks about this transferability of skills again. He says, do you think you could have done the Empire gig if you weren't a film lover? Because surely his point is, yes, he agrees that they're very transferable, but actually on some titles, you've got to live it. You've got to love it.
I think it helps. So I've always had a passion for film and TV. You know, it's part of why I was so keen to introduce television into Empire. But I wouldn't have been able to introduce television into Empire if it was just my passion, if that wasn't where culture was moving. So it became apparent that cinematic television was going to come up and start to not necessarily challenge film, but really be on a level in terms of investment, in terms of profit, in terms of creativity, in terms of breaking new talent, in terms of where filmmakers and actors were wanting to work. So I think of course, with specialist titles, you have to have a certain level of knowledge. Passion obviously always helps. But for me, it's always been the passion for crafting magazines, for working on a magazine brand. That has always come first and foremost. Yeah, I mean, you know, I said earlier that I could edit a car magazine. It would probably take me a while to get, you know, up to date on the steering wheel and the clutch and, you know, the boot and stuff like that.
How autonomous they'll be driving themselves soon, Terri, won't be a problem.
But I should also say the really important thing is I didn't know the most about film on Empire. I'm a massive film fan and I love film, but Chris Hewitt, James Dyer, Nick DeSemlian all know, and Chris Lupton all know far more about film than me and about, for example, the core franchises that Empire really spotlighted. So your team is there often to be those, you know, Chris Hewitt is a mad obsessive film fan who's happened to get a job. He's also a brilliant journalist and broadcaster and probably one of Empire's biggest assets by far. So I think it's a combination of the expertise you build around you and a passion you have. But I think never underestimate the passion just for magazines and for crafting and creating magazines. That's always been my first love, is magazine making, and it always will be.
Right. 2 minutes left. I'm going to ask you, see if we can do really speedy answers to 2 final questions.
You know, I don't do speedy.
What, and biggest regrets in your journalism, in your editing career?
Oh,
anything that you...
No, because I don't believe in it. I think every decision leads on to the next one.
Okay, good. Best bit, what's the single best memory you have of that 20 years of editing or being involved in magazines?
Probably what Steven Spielberg at the Empire Awards. Meeting Steven Spielberg.
Church Power of a good magazine, but Church Power of Empire, amazing. And this is almost an impossible one to answer. Quick take on the future of magazines.
Oh fuck! Well, look, magazines aren't dying. Ignore everybody who says. I think the market's ended up where we thought it would, which is specialist magazines are really thriving. Ones that really talk to a specific community. Your broader lifestyle magazines are always going to struggle. What we're going to have to see is the brands that will live and prosper will be that brands. And it's really important that, and everyone talks about diversification and then doesn't do it, but really, like, for those brands to survive, there has to be investment in other ways of making money, and there cannot be a reliance on one revenue stream, whether that be print or advertising or digital. Probably not digital at the moment, but that can't be it. We have to start looking at brands with 3, 4, 5 healthy revenue streams, and we also have to look at investment. If companies do not invest in talent, in infrastructure, in tech, in content, then that's going to be, that for me is the biggest challenge.
Yeah. And well, listen, we have 1 minute to go. I'm going to say a huge thank you to Terri White, the reigning Mark Boxer Award winner from the BSME. Terri, it's been we could have done another hour easily, but I'm so grateful you've joined us to be able to like share the wisdom, what you've learned along the way of 2 decades of editing and being involved in magazines. I'm going to sort of say a huge thank you to the kind people at Bob Rickard in Soho. There's another one in the city. They have been a wonderful host for us today, allowed us in. The restaurant's closed, it's lovely and quiet, but look at it, it's amazing. Do come and visit. I'm going to mention Terri's book again. Quite harrowing read, Terri, but it's amazingly powerful, powerful bit of kit. She's very kindly signed my wife's copy. We're going to give this away on the BSME socials. So keep an eye out on Twitter, Instagram, etc. on the BSME socials, and we'll arrange a mechanism to give that away. Final one, BSME Awards, deadline 6 p.m. tonight. Any journalists or editors out there, we hope you're entering. If you're struggling for any reason, contact Juliet or David, the administrators for BSME, and we'll see what we can do. But we're looking forward to that. And thank you for watching. Bang on 2 o'clock. We're bang on time. Terri, once again, big thank you. It's been absolutely fantastic.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.